Picture this. Three of the biggest names in mixed martial arts history, all moving at once, all on a collision course, and nobody can agree on what actually happened behind the scenes. One fighter says he was ready to step into the cage. Another says the whole thing fell apart over money. A third man, the most famous fighter on the planet, has already fought this exact battle before, against injury, against doubt, against his own body, and now he's back, standing in front of the world again, saying he's a different man. This is the story of how the biggest fight in the sport almost happened, why it didn't, and why the man everyone thought was finished for good is suddenly the center of attention all over again. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand where things stand right now, you have to go back to a night that changed everything. It was the summer of 2021. Conor McGregor stepped into the Octagon against Dustin Poirier for the third time. The two men had a score to settle, a rivalry that had already produced one shocking finish for each side, and this was supposed to be the decider. Instead, in the middle of the very first round, something went horribly wrong. McGregor's leg snapped as he planted his foot to throw a kick. The image is one of the most replayed moments in UFC history. A champion, a superstar, a man who had once stood at the very top of two different weight divisions at the same time, suddenly reduced to a man in agony on the canvas, his leg bent in a way legs are not supposed to bend. For most fighters, an injury like that would end a career on the spot. For McGregor, it began a different kind of fight. Surgeons put a titanium rod through his leg, from the knee down to the ankle. What followed wasn't a few months of rehab. It was years. Years of rebuilding strength in a limb that had been shattered. Years of watching the sport move on without him. Watching new stars rise. Watching the lightweight and welterweight divisions reshape themselves in his absence. For a while, it looked like the McGregor story might simply end there, with an image of a broken leg being the final chapter of one of combat sport's most explosive careers. But that's not how this story goes. Because nearly 5 years to the day since that night in Las Vegas, Conor McGregor is coming back. Not in some small regional show, not in an exhibition, but in the main event of a major UFC card, right back at the center of the sport's biggest stage. UFC CEO Dana White made the announcement himself, and it sent a shockwave through the entire combat sports world. The man they call the Notorious, the man who built modern mixed martial arts into a mainstream phenomenon with his personality as much as his fists, was stepping back into the cage. And the opponent chosen for this comeback is not some easy voyage back into the sport. It's Max Holloway. If you know the history between these two men, you know this is not just any fight. Back in 2013, long before either man had won a UFC championship, long before either man was a household name, McGregor and Holloway crossed paths in Boston. McGregor won that fight by decision. It was early in both of their careers, a stepping stone fight that nobody could have known would matter again more than a decade later. Since then, both men have gone on to have Hall of Fame-worthy careers. Holloway became a two-time featherweight champion, one of the most durable, most technically gifted strikers the sport has ever produced. McGregor, of course, became the first fighter in UFC history to hold 2 championship belts in 2 different weight divisions simultaneously, a feat that had never been done before and has never quite been matched since. Now these two men are set to run it back, 5 years after McGregor's injury, 13 years after their first meeting, in front of a sold-out crowd at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. The date is July 11th. The event is UFC 329, and it's being billed as the crown jewel of International Fight Week, one of the busiest and most star-studded weekends on the entire UFC calendar. Here's the thing about McGregor's return that makes it so fascinating. He is not walking back into this fight as the favorite. In fact, by most accounts, he is stepping in as a significant underdog. Think about that for a moment. This is a man who spent years as the most feared striker in the sport, a man whose left hand alone was enough to end fights in seconds. And now, coming off a 5-year layoff, going up against a fighter who has only gotten better with time, the odds are stacked against him. But if there's one thing we know about McGregor, it's that he thrives when people doubt him. He built his entire legend on being the confident underdog, the man who talks a big game, and then somehow, impossibly, backs it up. And true to form, in the lead up to this fight, McGregor has been doing exactly what he always does. Talking, predicting, building the drama. He's described his upcoming performance in dramatic terms, promising something powerful and definitive, saying he understands exactly what kind of damage Holloway has already absorbed over the course of his long career, and that all it will take is landing clean. He's dismissed suggestions that Holloway has drastically improved since their first encounter, arguing that whatever growth Holloway experienced afterward actually came from adapting some of McGregor's own techniques. Whether or not you buy into the trash talk, there's no denying that the confidence hasn't wavered, even after everything his body has been through. And what has his body been through? McGregor has been remarkably candid about it. He describes his leg now as fully healed, held together by a titanium rod running from his knee down into his ankle, something he jokes about, saying it makes him feel like a machine, unbreakable in a way he wasn't before. He's talked about how the years of rehabilitation were not just physically transformative, but mentally transformative too, forcing him to relearn his own body, his own mechanics, his own movement patterns from scratch. It's easy to see this as spin, as the kind of thing any fighter would say before a big comeback fight. But it's also true that very few athletes have gone through what McGregor went through and come back at all, let alone at the highest level of one of the most dangerous sports on the planet. So that's the McGregor half of the story. But he is far from the only headline coming out of the UFC this summer. Because while all of this has been happening, an entirely different drama has been playing out at the very top of two other divisions, involving two men whom many consider to be, right now, the two best pound-for-pound fighters on the planet. Their names are Islam Makhachev and Ilia Topuria. If you don't follow the sport closely, let's break down exactly who these two men are, and why the entire combat sports world has been holding its breath waiting for them to fight each other. Islam Makhachev comes from Dagestan, the same region that produced Khabib Nurmagomedov, one of the most dominant lightweight champions in UFC history. In fact, Makhachev trained alongside Khabib for years, learning under the same coaches, absorbing the same relentless, suffocating style of wrestling and grappling that made Khabib nearly impossible to beat. When Khabib retired undefeated, many wondered if anyone could fill that void. Makhachev didn't just fill it. He built on it. He won the lightweight title. He defended it repeatedly, in dominant fashion, grinding opponents into the mat and finishing fights with a calm, methodical brutality. And then, not satisfied with ruling one division, he moved up in weight and captured a second championship, becoming a two-division champion himself, following in the footsteps of the very man who trained him. Then there's Ilia Topuria. Spanish-born, of Georgian heritage, Topuria burst onto the scene with a combination of power, speed, and supreme self-belief that immediately drew comparisons to McGregor himself. He took the featherweight title in dramatic fashion, and then did something almost unheard of. He moved up a weight class, and won a second championship there too, defeating the legendary Charles Oliveira to claim the lightweight crown in the summer of 2025. Just like that, Topuria became a two-division champion in his own right, standing shoulder to shoulder with Makhachev at the very top of the sport's pound-for-pound rankings. Two men, two active champions, two of the most dominant fighters of this entire era, and an existing rivalry that had already been simmering for years, filled with public jabs, confident predictions, and mutual disrespect. It is, without exaggeration, one of the biggest fights that can possibly be made in the sport today. Analysts have called it the kind of super fight that comes around maybe once in a generation. Two reigning champions from different weight classes, both undefeated at the elite level, both with legitimate claims to being the best fighter on the planet. So naturally, everyone wanted to know, when is this fight happening? For a while, it looked like the stars had finally aligned. There was serious talk of Makhachev versus Topuria taking place at one of the most extraordinary UFC events ever conceived, a card set to be held at the White House itself, a spectacle unlike anything the promotion had ever attempted. The idea alone generated massive buzz. Imagine the two best fighters in the world, colliding not in a typical arena, but on the lawn of the most powerful address in America. It would have been historic in every sense of the word. And then, just before the official announcement, it all fell apart. What actually happened depends on who you ask, and that's exactly why this story became so explosive. According to Makhachev's side, he had already accepted the fight. He says he got the call, agreed to face Topuria at the White House, and was fully prepared to go through with it, even though he was dealing with a hand injury at the time, an injury he insists he would have fought through if the contract had simply been finalized. But according to Makhachev, the next thing he heard was that Topuria's camp had asked for an unrealistic purse, a number the UFC wasn't willing to meet, and so the fight collapsed before it ever got off the ground. Makhachev didn't hold back his frustration either, essentially accusing Topuria's team of spreading a false narrative about what really happened, saying he was tired of hearing made-up stories. But Topuria tells a very different version of events. Speaking about the situation, Topuria explained that the fight really was close to happening, that before he ultimately agreed to face a different opponent, he had in fact been lined up to fight Makhachev. He remains hopeful the two of them will eventually meet in the Octagon, saying he still believes it's going to happen at some point, possibly before the year is over. And it wasn't just Topuria pushing back on Makhachev's version of the story. UFC CEO Dana White himself addressed the conflicting accounts publicly, stating that the claim about Topuria pulling out over financial disagreements simply isn't accurate. That single comment shifted the spotlight, placing more scrutiny on Makhachev's camp and his manager regarding how the negotiations actually unfolded. So here you have it. Two of the greatest fighters on the planet, a fight the entire sport wanted to see, an unprecedented White House event that could have cemented this rivalry in combat sports history, and instead, a public back and forth over who is really to blame for it falling through. Was it a hand injury? Was it money? Was it ego? Was it bad blood boiling over at exactly the wrong moment? The truth might be some combination of all of it, and honestly, that's part of what makes this rivalry so compelling. Neither man is backing down from his version of events, and neither man seems willing to let the other control the narrative. With the White House fight dead, the UFC had to pivot quickly, and that pivot ended up shaping the entire summer schedule. Topuria was rerouted into a lightweight title unification fight against Justin Gaethje, one of the most feared strikers in the sport, a man known for his violent, relentless style and his willingness to trade in the pocket with anyone. This fight itself became one of the most anticipated of the year, given how differently styled the two men are. Topuria, a devastating counterstriker with knockout power in both hands. Gaethje, a walk-forward brawler who has never in his career backed down from a firefight. The winner of that fight was always going to be positioned as the next great challenge for whoever holds the other major lightweight or welterweight belt in the sport. Meanwhile, Makhachev has been dealing with his own path forward. Nursing that hand injury, he's been eyeing a return to the Octagon this summer, and reports have pointed toward him defending his title against Ian Machado Gary, an Irish fighter with his own growing reputation and his own colorful personality. That fight has been positioned for UFC 330, 1 month after McGregor's own comeback fight, continuing this incredible stretch of major UFC events packed into just a few weeks of the calendar. And here's where things get even more interesting, because Makhachev hasn't been shy about downplaying the significance of that fight either. He's publicly compared the Gary matchup to a cheaper, lesser version of arguably the most famous rivalry in UFC history, the clash between his own mentor Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor. Understandably, Gary didn't take that comparison lying down, firing back publicly at Makhachev for the remark. It's a reminder that even outside of the Topuria saga, Makhachev is a fighter who knows exactly how to generate headlines, who understands the value of provocative comments, and who isn't afraid to ruffle feathers heading into a title defense. So now picture the entire landscape of the sport as it stands heading into this stretch of summer events. You have Conor McGregor, the most famous fighter in the history of the sport, coming back from a horrific injury to face Max Holloway in what promises to be an emotional, star-powered spectacle. You have Ilia Topuria, a two-division champion, stepping into a massive unification fight against Justin Gaethje after a deal to face Makhachev collapsed amid finger-pointing and conflicting stories. And you have Islam Makhachev, another two-division champion, defending his title against Ian Machado Gary while continuing to insist that the real fight, the one the whole world wants to see, is still out there waiting to happen eventually. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how rare this moment actually is. Combat sports fans often complain, and rightfully so, that the biggest potential fights get delayed, negotiated into oblivion, or simply never happen at all because of politics, money, or ego. But what's happening right now is different. Multiple genuine super fights, involving some of the most talented and most compelling personalities in the entire sport, are all converging within the same few months. Whether or not the biggest of them all, Makhachev versus Topuria, eventually happens exactly the way fans hope. The drama surrounding its collapse has only added fuel to an already blazing fire. There's also something worth noting about how these rivalries intersect in ways you might not expect. When a rival boxer recently mocked Topuria over his loss in the White House fight situation, it was none other than Conor McGregor who stepped in to defend him publicly, criticizing the boxer for what McGregor viewed as an unfair and cowardly jab. It was a surprising moment, McGregor, of all people, coming to Topuria's defense, especially given how much trash talk usually flies freely between rival fighters in this sport. But it's also a reminder that beneath all the promotional talk and manufactured beef, there is often a code among fighters, an understanding of just how difficult this profession truly is, and a willingness to stand up for each other when outsiders try to take cheap shots. As for what happens next, that's really the question hanging over the entire sport right now. Does McGregor's comeback go the way he's predicting, A spectacular and definitive victory that instantly puts him back at the top of every fan's wish list for his next fight? Or does the 5-year layoff prove too much to overcome against a hungry, well-rounded opponent like Holloway, who has continued sharpening his skills this entire time? Does Topuria come through his unification fight against Gaethje with his 2 championships intact, setting himself up for the eventual showdown with Makhachev that fans have been begging for? Or does Gaethje's brutal, relentless pressure finally catch up to him? And does Makhachev cruise through his defense against Gary while continuing to wait, patiently or not so patiently, for a rematch of circumstances that will finally allow the biggest fight in the sport to actually happen? Nobody knows the answers yet. That's exactly what makes this such a gripping moment in mixed martial arts history. You have legends returning from the brink. You have champions colliding, negotiations collapsing, public accusations flying back and forth, and a super fight that the entire sport wants but that keeps slipping just out of reach. Every press conference, every interview, every offhand comment from Makhachev or Topuria gets dissected by fans and analysts alike, searching for clues about when, or if, these 2 men will finally step into the cage together. And let's not forget, this entire chapter of the sport's history is unfolding against the backdrop of a completely reshaped landscape for the promotion itself. The UFC recently entered a massive new broadcasting partnership, ending the traditional pay-per-view model that had defined the sport for decades. That change alone has altered how the promotion approaches its biggest events, and it's part of why 2026 has already produced such an unprecedented run of major fights and major moments. The White House card, unusual as the concept sounds, was part of that larger strategy, an attempt to plant the sports flag in a completely new cultural space, merging combat sports with a level of mainstream, national spectacle rarely attempted before. Even though the marquee Makhachev versus Topuria fight didn't end up happening there, the ambition behind that event tells you everything about where the sport is heading and how much bigger these events are becoming. Think about McGregor's journey specifically for a moment, because it really is remarkable when you step back and look at the full picture. Here is a man who, at his peak, redefined what a UFC superstar could be. He didn't just fight. He performed. He talked. He built anticipation in ways nobody in the sport had ever done before him. His fights weren't just athletic contests. They were events, spectacles that pulled in casual fans who had never watched a single UFC card before. And then, in the middle of everything, his career seemed to come crashing down in that one horrifying moment against Poirier. For years, there was genuine uncertainty about whether he would ever compete again at anywhere near that level. Some wondered if he'd fight again at all. And now here we are, watching him step back into the cage against one of the most dangerous strikers in the sport's history, doing it not quietly, not cautiously, but with the same bold confidence and dramatic flair that made him famous in the first place. There's also a broader storyline at play here involving the very concept of legacy in this sport. McGregor has already secured his place in history books. Nothing that happens against Holloway changes the fact that he was the first simultaneous 2-division champion in UFC history. But legacies in combat sports are complicated things. Fans remember not just championships but moments, and there's clearly a part of McGregor that wants one more defining moment, one more chapter that proves the injury didn't define the end of his story. Win or lose against Holloway, the mere fact that he's stepping back into that cage after everything his body has been through is already, in its own way, a remarkable achievement. Meanwhile, for Topuria and Makhachev, the stakes are slightly different, but no less compelling. These are 2 men in the primes of their careers, both with legitimate arguments for being called the best fighter alive today, and both fully aware that history is watching to see if they'll ever actually settle it inside the Octagon. Every interview, every comment about purses, injuries, and negotiations only adds more weight to whatever fight eventually happens between them. If and when Makhachev versus Topuria finally gets made, it will carry with it not just the significance of 2 champions colliding, but the added drama of everything that happened before it, the cancelled White House card, the conflicting stories, the accusations of dishonesty flying in both directions. That kind of build-up doesn't happen by accident, and whether the promotion planned it this way or not, it has turned this rivalry into one of the most talked-about storylines in the entire sport. So where does that leave us right now, in this moment? McGregor's comeback fight against Holloway looms just days away as International Fight Week approaches, promising to be one of the most watched UFC events in years, driven by 5 years of pent-up anticipation and genuine uncertainty about how the sport's biggest star will look after everything he's been through. Topuria continues preparing for his massive unification bout, carrying the weight of 2 championships and the added motivation of proving that his side of the White House story was the true one. Makhachev, still working his way back from injury, prepares to defend his title against Gary while continuing to insist, whether fans believe him or not, that the fight everyone wants to see is still very much on the table for the future. 3 storylines. 3 sets of stakes. All colliding within the same electric stretch of the calendar. All connected by rivalries, near misses, and unanswered questions about who is telling the truth and who will ultimately come out on top. This is exactly the kind of moment that makes combat sports so unpredictable and so endlessly fascinating. Fighters can talk all they want in interviews and press conferences. They can spin narratives in their own favor. They can accuse each other of dishonesty and bad faith. But eventually, all of that noise gets stripped away the moment the cage door closes. Whatever was said beforehand stops mattering the second the fight actually begins. That's the beauty of this sport, and it's exactly why so many fans are glued to their screens right now, waiting to see how these overlapping storylines play out. Will McGregor prove that 5 years and a shattered leg couldn't stop him from reclaiming his place among the sports elite? Will Topuria come through his unification fight with both championships intact, keeping alive the dream of finally settling things with Makhachev? And will Makhachev, after all the accusations and conflicting stories about what really happened with the White House fight, finally get the chance to prove, once and for all, exactly where he stands against the only other fighter in the world who can truly claim to be his equal? The questions are out there. The fighters have spoken, sometimes in agreement, often in direct contradiction of each other. And soon, very soon, the cage door is going to close on some of these stories, and we'll finally start getting real answers instead of speculation. Until then, all we can do is watch closely, pay attention to every word from every press conference, and get ready for what could end up being one of the most memorable stretches in the entire history of the sport. Because right now, in this exact moment, with legends returning, champions colliding, and rivalries boiling right at the surface, mixed martial arts has never felt more alive.